Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is at Close Talking. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is at Close Talking Poetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/closetalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show. Hey everybody, this is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley with a quick introductory note to this brand new episode of Close Talking. This episode deals with a whole lot of different issues, but we touch on repeatedly the United States' relationship with the various conflicts and civil wars going on in South and Central America during the 1980s. We talk a little bit about how those conflicts have been forgotten and remembered, but there was a news event that felt like it needed special attention in the context of this conversation, and that is that Oliver North was made the president of the National Rifle Association, the NRA. Oliver North is probably best known as the person indicted in the Iran-Contra Scandal, which, for anyone who doesn't know, that was the sale of arms to Iran, which was under an arms embargo at the time, to fund right-wing militias in Nicaragua, the Contras. So the fact that he could do all of that and still end up the head of one of the largest lobbying groups in the country is a pretty powerful example of how that era and U.S. involvement with despicable groups is remembered and has affected people's careers, which is that it has largely been forgotten or brushed under a rug, and that those people's careers have continued on. So don't want to go on for too long. Without further ado, let's get into the episode.
Welcome to an all-new episode of Close Talking. I'm your co-host, Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am your other co-host, Jack Rossiter Munley.
And we have, as always, a great poem for you today. One of my personal faves that I've been thinking about for a while. It is called Because One is Always Forgotten by Carolyn Forche. And, a little context before we read it, because that will be helpful. It's from Forche's collection, The Country Between Us, which came out in 1981. And much of it takes place when she was living in El Salvador. She was working as a journalist for Amnesty International, and many of these poems came out of that, and this poem is one of those. This one is an elegy for Jose Rudolfo Viera, who was...
He was the head of the Salvadoran Agrarian Institute.
Yes, And he was notably assassinated in 1981 along with two Americans. He was working, this was during the beginning of the 12-year civil war in El Salvador, and was under Duarte's rule. And Viera had figured out that some of the money that had been designated for agrarian reform was not going to actually be used for that, but was being pocketed by Duarte's administration and other people who were in the military. And so as Viera reported on this, which was sort of thought to be why he was murdered. And I think that's perhaps most of... a little bit about Forche is that she's best known for, in some ways, for her anthology, Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness.
Yep, that's certainly where I know her from.
And she's credited for sort of coining the term poetry of witness. She named a kind of genre of poetry. And that anthology sort of compiles mostly poetry from sort of like war times or times of sort of severe violence that are sort of bearing witness to those events. But this book was also a huge success, and it was actually a bestseller, which rarely happens for poetry. And so she did come to prominence, I think, really with this and then with the anthology. Her first book also won the Yale Series of Younger Poets Prize, which came out when she was 24. I think that's most of the context, I think, that you need, and we can talk more about it later.
Sounds good.
Okay. Because one is always forgotten. In Memoriam, Jose Rudolfo Viera, 1939 to 1981, El Salvador. When Viera was buried, we knew it had come to an end, his coffin rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle. I could take my heart, he said, and give it to a campesino, and he would cut it up and give it back. You can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years. A boy soldier in the bone-hot sun works his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from the branch of a tree flowering with such faces. The heart is the toughest part of the body. Tenderness is in the hands.
Wow.
Yeah. Pretty intense.
Very intense.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of the poem we discussed by I've gotta stop loving you, so I killed my black goat. At least in terms of the kind of brutality of the imagery, of the literal imagery, and the way that it's sort of used for figurative purposes.
Definitely. And I think I had the same thought, but it's interesting because it's in the context of an elegy, which is like a commemoration. So I feel like there's this really intense imagery, but it's almost softened by the extra textual setting in some ways, because its purpose is always pointed towards this life that has been lost, which doesn't make it any less powerful. It just gives it a different feeling, I think, when that kind of imagery is deployed.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And it's different than I's poem, which sort of, you could argue, deliberately plays up the grotesque in order to make a point or to evoke something in particular. Whereas in this poem, both, as you were saying, it's pointing to this, this elegy, this tender sense of loss, but also the sort of brutality that it's depicting, is just sort of what's present. The war, the civil war, and everything that was going on in El Salvador at the time was quite horrific, and so her descriptions of it aren't like hyperbolic in that sense, in the way that I's poem, might have been leaning towards in some way.
And I's poem also sort of takes off at the end and goes into these really wild images about, the acid rain and all this, very much creates a heightened atmosphere, whereas this feels very grounded and real the whole time. There are these stark images, a boy soldier in the bone hot sun cutting off a person's face. But in the context of the El Salvadoran Civil War, that is probably a scene that has been witnessed, to use a very loaded term, by either Carolyn Forche as the poet, or it has been reported to her that somebody has told her about this.
One thing I should just a couple other contextual things.
Yeah.
Campesino means like peasant farmer in Spanish, and so that's just in the poem. I could take my heart, he said, and give it to a campesino, and he would cut it up and give it back. And then also, this was something I didn't know until I did more research. But the part, you can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years. The 4 dark chambers are on the one hand referring to sort of the 4 chambers of the heart, but on the other hand are referring to what was referred to as the dark place, La Oscura, which was these 1 meter by 1 meter prison cells where people could be kept. And so that's also a reference to those things. So
yeah, those are excellent notes, which are probably good for getting us on the ground where we need to be. So my question is that this is an elegy, right? And an elegy is usually, it's a remembrance basically of a life that has been lost. But the title of this piece is Because One is Always Forgotten. So I'm a little curious how you take that title.
Yeah, that is a good
I know
question.
I have a couple thoughts, but I'm curious to know, because I know that you've sat with this poem and thought about it more deeply than I have. I'm curious to know what you think.
No, that is a very good question. I suppose my first thought is that it's, in a way, the occasion for the elegy. So, Because One is Always Forgotten, this poem is a small way of writing against that, or writing to preserve this person's memory, but also their sort of place in history and the history and resistance that he sort of represented at the time. And so it seems to be like, because one is always forgotten, I have written this poem. At the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that's the only thing, because it's such a pessimistic, it's such a definitive title. One is always forgotten. It's not because one can be forgotten, or like it's possible to forget things. I've written this poem. So it seems, even in the act of writing this in remembrance, there's a sense of defeat about it, which I think she gets at in this first line, which is still a little unclear to me exactly. But when Viera was buried, we knew it had come to an end. This kind of his death and his burial, signaling the end or the death of something larger. I assume some kind of resistance to Duarte, or something there. But then I sort of am struggling with where she's going after that, I guess.
I like all of that, and that's pretty much where I went with it as well. It also put me in mind of the fact that a term that's often used in reference to what happened to dissidents and even just people who, were accused by neighbors or who got on the wrong side of the government in a lot of these different South and Central American conflicts of the 70s and 80s, not just the El Salvadoran Civil War, but more generally as being disappeared. And so being forgotten and being disappeared seem highly related to me. And that's not necessarily what happened to Viera, but I think it does call to what was happening to people like him in his country and in other countries who were in similar situations.
Yeah, no, that seems right. And just for additional context, the Civil War was around 12 years long. It started with the coup that was October 15th, 1979, and lasted until January 16th of 92. And the UN estimates that over 75,000 people were killed. And that an unknown number of people were sort of disappeared and never, their bodies were never found. And I think it also speaks to, I wonder how specifically Forche was talking about this, but one of the projects of, witnessing or this kind of writing or, journalism, especially, from what would be considered, like the lefty side or the radical left or whatever, is that, the people in power, both in El Salvador, but also, in the U.S., who certainly Forche had in mind as her audience, at least in part, because, she's American and she was publishing it in America, and it's in English, etc., is that, often these resistances are erased from historical memory. So in addition to the physical, literal killings and disappearances, there's an erasure that happens in the sort of writing of history itself. And so the poem, as it strives to remember this particular man, is also sort of claiming a spot in the historical record of this particular resistance that was happening.
Totally. And I think this poem also, in time, has been proven to be very relevant just because the United States has begun to reckon more completely, not anywhere near enough, but with its own complicity in many of these various conflicts. They supported the regime against which Viera was working. I think it was in 1987 that Jose Duarte went to the White House and met with Reagan, and Reagan, it's some sort of like really horrible anodyne, something like, "We admire your efforts on behalf of democracy and human rights in El Salvador," or something. Just some really gross, diplomat speak that also indicates just how much the people in power at the time in the United States were willing to support right-wing juntas and military men because they were worried about the various Marxist guerrilla groups. In many ways, having a poem like this that not only remembers the violence of the time, but calls out one person and remembers a person who stood up against that institutional abuses of power and violence is really powerful, particularly over time. I think it gains it holds a power even when it is written and first said that is unique, and I think it gains a different kind of power over time.
Just jumping off that, there's so much sort of stupid conversation about the kind of immigration quote unquote crisis that the U.S. is having, and a lot of the people and kids who are seeking asylum, are coming from El Salvador. And there's a real lack of history in the way that people talk about that. It's like in the like mainstream conversation, it's like no one ever talks about why they would be coming here or why the conditions got so bad. And one thing that this poem does a little bit of speaking to and plays a part in is sort of locating, the conditions for future conditions. And as you say, the U.S. is, not just complicity, but like active role in facilitating those conditions.
And sadly, not a whole lot has changed because you see the same sort of apathy combined. I mean, really, not just apathy, but in some ways, as you're saying, active work in what's going on, particularly in Syria, just a complete abdication of any desire to be involved.
Yeah, it's depressing.
Indeed.
We both went to the same public high school, which was like moderately liberal or whatever. I probably got among the more liberal public educations that I think many people did in the country. And there was a very little sense that I got, although there were, I think, some teachers that did a better job about it, of the extent to which the U.S. supported oppressive regimes in Latin America and elsewhere. And the one example that really sticks out of just like how deep it goes, this is like way back, is we had to write an essay about manifest destiny. That was like, the question was like, to what extent was it like good?
Oh, jeez.
And it's like, it was bad for sure. It was like zero extent.
To zero extent was it good? It was not.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yeah.
Essay done.
Yeah.
My source that I would like to cite is reality.
Reality.
And done.
Yeah. But just the fact that, I mean, at the time, I didn't think that it was a weird question because I had just grown up thinking, America was a good project or whatever. And even if some bad things happened overall, it was blah, blah, blah for the best. And so you could think about in that context, the manifest destiny as a complicated ideology or something rather than one that was, blatantly fucked up.
Racist,
imperialistic, etc.
exploitative, colonialist.
Yeah. It really has, even more so than just the conversations that happen when like moments happen in politics or current events. But the way that I think, most people are educated has a built-in very limited memory for certain things.
That's a great point. I think that's a really excellent point. I don't know if you've read this book, but if anybody's interested in the full reasons that the United States acted the way it did towards South and Central America at that time, and indeed how that legacy carried forward, particularly the economic benefits to certain people of having major strife. I recommend Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, which is about disaster capitalism, and it is very good if you're interested in that stuff.
That's been on my list to read, but I've heard really great things about it.
It is good, and it really gets to the heart of a lot of this stuff. Speaking of heart,
oh my God,
heart shows up 3 times in this poem in 3 slightly different ways. And I was curious if you have any thoughts about that. Because first, it's being given, and then it can't be eaten, and then it is the toughest part of the body.
Yes. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think that the way that heart works in this poem is the true strength of it as a poem, I think. And I have this working theory about poems, which I've been thinking a lot about, because I've been trying to come up with ways of, assessing a poem on a sort of more essential level, even if it doesn't sort of account for all poems, like, how do poems like really work? And I started thinking about this when I came across the quote. There's this quote by Robert Lowell that says, a poem is an event, not a record of an event. And he may have gotten this from Walter Benjamin, who I think said something similar. But I was interested by this, and yet at the same time, I worried that it was just one of those like catchy things that people say about poetry because no one knows what it is. And it's like a poem's a thing. It's like poems are made of words, not ideas, or I don't know. There's like all sorts of little catchphrases that people use to define poetry. So I was interested in seeing if I could apply it. And I started thinking about the way that time works. We think of, in writing, there's sort of two times that are happening in every piece of writing, whether it's poetry or prose. There's the sort of time that it takes you to read it, there's the reader's time, and then there's the time that the piece of writing is referring to. And the interplay between these times is often, in all genres, a source of productive tension. One really good example of the way time is manipulated is in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, which is in 3 sections, and the first and third section takes place over the course of 1 day each. And then the second section, which is called Time Passes, is over several years. And there's a big main character that dies in the middle of the second section, and it happens in like a blink. And it's like a particularly devastating moment because you've spent so much time with that character in the first section, and then they die in almost no time. But the novel has structured it so that the 1 day took so much of your own reader's time, whereas the years took so little of your time. And so that kind of the tension between those two times makes that moment, I think, particularly effective. So I was thinking that maybe you could think about a poem becoming an event as when the two times sort of align with each other, that the reader's time aligns with the time of the poem, perhaps. And in this case, I feel like that happens with the way that heart works. And I started thinking about this by looking at this last couplet, which is very interesting to me. And it says, "The heart is the toughest part of the body. Tenderness is in the hands." And I was thinking if you saw this on its own, you'd think maybe this is like a nice aphorism, or maybe you'd think it's like a sappy thing.
It does have that it lends itself to a surface level reading that's very like, oh yeah, you can be hard-hearted, but like, your tender hands do good works or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's talking about, the heart in a figurative sense, which is already sort of a cliche in poetry. And so if you saw that couplet, by itself, it would not be a poem, I think. It would be at best a clever aphorism or a clever saying, but it wouldn't be a poem. And I think the way that this poem becomes a poem is the way that heart acquires sort of these contrasting meanings, which is to say, in the beginning, as you were pointing out, there's 2 other moments where it's, "I could take my heart," he said, "and give it to a campesino, and he would cut it up and give it back." And then, "You can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years." And here we have hearts as real, literal pieces of organ, and talked about in very explicit ways of being sliced up, removed from a body, potentially eaten. And so the heart as a thing acquires, it's very concrete status, which is not dissimilar to the way, as we were talking about when we talked about, the Eyes poem, the moment in Call Me by Your Name with the peach, where the peach has its literal sensory existence before it acquires the figurative existence. But when the moment happens at the end of the heart is the toughest part of the body, tenderness is in the hands, you have two readings that are happening at the same time. One is the kind of aphoristic, figurative thing that would be maybe even sentimental, which is paired against those literal, even gruesome or brutal sort of literal descriptions of the heart that are suddenly in your head at the same time. And to me, that's the moment at which the poem becomes a poem, because the time is dependent on the moment at which those two things are happening, are referring to something that has only happened in the poem itself. It's referring to the poem's literal descriptions of heart. And so the time that it takes the poem to get to those two moments is also at the same time for you. And so that kind of moment, I think, is like when it's kind of an event where you're like, oh, this is like happening. The poem is happening, and I am encountering an event, which is the poem. That's like my first. That's my first little thought about it.
I like that. I like that a lot, because it is true that when you get to that last couplet, you've been primed to be thinking of not a figurative heart, but a literal heart, which then takes toughest part of the body, which instead of me necessarily thinking of it as like, oh, the heart can be resilient, which is a meaning that's there too. What I'm thinking about is that the heart is a muscle that's never stopped working until you die, and the meat of the heart is tough meat. And I'm thinking of all of that. And even when the heart is previously discussed, you can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers. Number one, I'm thinking about the physical chambers of the heart. So it's already pointing back, even though it's not talking about the literal heart when it says those 4 chambers, it's still pointing back to a literal reading of heart. But also, you can't eat heart has the literal, I mean, people aren't going to be eating hearts there, but also you can't chip away at someone's resolve if it is strong enough just by putting them into these horrible cells. The heart itself is the toughest part of the body. It doesn't get broken down just by being put in these terrible conditions. If someone is committed to their resistance.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it also is interesting in the second part, the tenderness is in the hands, which is sort of a subtler moment where we've just had this seeming actually non sequitur where we've talked about, this moment with Viera being buried, and then he's talking about, I could take my heart, he's saying that. But then it's a boy soldier in the bone hot sun who sort of comes out of nowhere seemingly. And he's working his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from a tree. And so even though hands aren't mentioned there, I feel like it's implied that his hands are the tender hands in a way, which is like sort of unnerving based on, the kind of work that he's doing.
Yeah, it's very creepy. And also when it says that it's a branch of a tree flowering with such faces, it indicates there might already be other faces in the tree, that this boy or his other... there were a lot of child soldiers in these conflicts, particularly in the El Salvadoran Civil War, so it's a literal child soldier. But it indicates that he or others like him have been cutting off faces and putting them up in this tree for a while maybe, and that's just creepy. A creepy image too. A tree flowering with faces is just horrific. But it is also interesting because it indicates that this boy's heart has been hardened to whatever task he's being put to. The heart is the toughest part of the body. The tenderness is in the hands. He's still a boy. He still has child's hands that are doing this horrible work. It's quite something.
I mean, it's very chilling, but the word flowering is so good because it's such a beautiful word, and it evokes something in its own context that we associate with spring or, blossoming, beautiful flowers, life, etc. And, Forche could have written, that the tree had a lot of faces, or hang it from the tree that was littered with such faces or filled with such faces. And those would all be strong in their own right, but flowering is particularly effective because of the direct contrasting connotation that flowering has against what it's describing.
Definitely. It also adds to those two couplets about the boy soldier and the face stuff. Take an interesting natural turn because he's a boy soldier, and then we find out he's in the bone hot sun. So we already have more of a sensory, alive image and feeling. Then we do this remembrance of someone who's passed, which is first talking about the lowering of the coffin, and then what sounds like an interaction he had with somebody, or a written interaction that would be similar to something that was going on with him. But then when you take this detour, suddenly everything is immediate in a different way because we're getting information about what it actually feels like immediately. But it also, as I said, it's natural. There's the bone hot sun. There's a tree all of a sudden. It's a flowering tree. There's more natural imagery in those little couplets than there is in the whole rest of the poem. Mm-hmm. Which I think is interesting because it is also, as you were saying, flowering is a very spring rejuvenation life. This is a boy, he's young, he's a flowering person, he's turning into an adult, and he could either continue to live in a country where he cuts off faces and he is a soldier, or following the example of somebody like Viera, who is trying to create a country that would give him a different life. Mm-hmm. And hopefully his heart is tough enough that it would not stay in this place of violence, but the boy's heart, that is, it's the toughest part of the body. Possibly that's pointing to its resilience. Hopefully his heart is tough enough to move him from where he is now into a new place.
Yeah, and that also makes me think of, I think what we've been talking about is the moments of that event moment, or the moments of tension and meaning, what those provide. In a way, it's maybe similar to how we talked about the either the Dickinson To Make a Prairie or the Seshadri nursing home, where there were these gaps, and the gaps sort of allow this space for the reader to do a lot of interpretive work, or imaginative work. And similarly, I think when you have two meanings that are contained within the same word or the same phrase, in the way that flowering is, or the way that the heart is the toughest part of the body, it sort of blows open the possibilities because they're paradoxical, and so it sort of makes a lot of space within itself, I think. And then it makes me think of, there's just so many directions. There's so many directions you can go in. It's a 12-line poem, and it just gets so much going.
It does. This is one of those poems that just is exploding with meaning all over the place. Every word or phrase just feels like it could go in 5 different directions, and all of them are possibly equally intentional.
Yeah, because oh my gosh, okay, so this 4 dark chambers image is actually, when you think about it, it's wild, because basically there's a heart within a heart that's within a heart, because if you can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers, so you have a person who's has their own heart. They have a literal heart that they are trying and failing to eat. And then they are contained within 4 dark chambers, a sort of figurative heart, that's sort of also making them unable to eat. But then to think about that space, the dark space, as a heart, adds another insidious texture to that final line, the heart is the toughest part of the body. Not only is it resilient, not only is it hardened, not only does it not give you sustenance, but it's a prison. It's a horrible prison.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love where that goes, because we often talk about the concept of like the body politic, but if you think about a repressive regime, the heart of that regime is its restrictive and violent, perverted justice, in air quotes that you can't see on the podcast, justice system. And the heart of that is the prison. And then within that heart is this further four dark 1 meter by 1 meter dark place chambers. So you really are just condensing down into this, heart within a heart. I like that a lot. I think that's really cool. I like that you did that.
I didn't do it. It was
Carolyn Forche. Okay. I like that you pulled that out of the poem. Yeah, this is all Carolyn Forche.
Yeah. No, she's such a good poemer. She
is. Poemist. I don't know what the word is for people who write poems.
Yeah. People try to come up with words for it, but nothing ever sticks,
Poesizer.
Poesizer. That's pretty good. And then it makes me feel like we've tackled a lot of it, but then the first couplet is interesting. I'm curious what you think about it. When Viera was buried, we knew it had come to an end. His coffin rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle. That little simile, it's just an interesting move there. So the coffin, we can sort of see the coffin descending into the ground, and it sort of going back and forth a little bit. So, it's an apt description. But then it's like a boat or a cradle, which gives us two very different connotative things. Cradle, we're lulling a baby to sleep. Whereas a boat, lots of things with boats. Anyway, I was just curious because it doesn't explicitly come back up. There's not like boat or cradle or things associated with those images that return. It's kind of said and left. And I was curious how you were reading those.
That part also I sort of stopped at, because it's also not really it's more direct than almost anything else in the poem in terms of how it's describing something. And also just because rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle, we often talk about a rocking boat or rocking a cradle. Like it's a very straightforward one thing to the next kind of way of describing.
A cliche. Yeah.
It's like a rocking and a boat and a cradle.
Yeah.
Right. That rocks. It does create a very clear image of what's happening with this coffin, and it makes it a very human experience. Like it isn't just being airlifted in, some sort of perfect lowering. You see, at least I envision it as like four people, each on the end of ropes that are lowering it into the ground. Like it makes it a very down to earth image. The mention of the boat probably obviously put me in mind of Billy Collins's poem, The Dead, just because it's boats and it's death and and there's lots of images that have to do with the fairy people who take you across a river into the underworld. I think Cradle also is almost a hint towards the boy soldier who comes in later. And it is also a hint to life and birth and holding on to, regeneration in the face of death. So that's just like a lot of different places I went with those. I don't know that I have a great hot take on it.
Yeah. No, but those seem like good readings. And it is interesting to think that rocking a boat, rocking a cradle are the reader does not have to stretch. Those are like pre-made poetic things.
They also say don't rock the boat, as in like don't cause trouble, which is very much what Viera was doing. He was absolutely rocking the boat.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. And in a way, I wonder, this might be a far stretch, but the last couplet, it's not like ready-made poetry, but it does seem a little more like on its own could be read as sort of a cliche. And the sort of deliberate playing with cliche maybe is set up a bit with the very straightforward simile in the first couplet. Do you have anything else?
I don't think so. Other than to note just what a major concern all of this was at the time that this was being written. And in the 1980s, there was just huge popular concern. As you noted, like the book that this is in became a bestseller. It was on the popular mind. The lead single from the Rolling Stones' 1983 album was about like death squads and disappearances in South America. And there's just like a lot of popular culture from the time. And I feel like that is something that has not survived in the same way that other major like political concerns that were popular culture concerns do. I feel like that has really just fallen away. And particularly in the context of this poem about memory, it's good to have that in there.
Yeah, definitely. Should we read it again?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Because one is always forgotten. In memoriam, Jose Rudolfo Viera, 1939 to 1981, El Salvador. When Viera was buried, we knew it had come to an end, his coffin rocking into the ground like a boat or a cradle. I could take my heart, he said, and give it to a campesino, and he would cut it up and give it back. You can't eat heart in those 4 dark chambers where a man can be kept years. A boy soldier in the bone-hot sun works his knife to peel the face from a dead man and hang it from the branch of a tree flowering with such faces. The heart is the toughest part of the body. Tenderness is in the hands.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. Whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/closetalking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything's possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.